Welcome everyone to another NASCAR Heat Evolution video. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at a race setup for Pocono. And before we get into that, let me just take a minute to say that this track is absolutely a blast to run. There is so much grip out there that it's unreal. So much speed. In fact, I'm pretty sure at this point that I don't have all the speed there is to get around this place. But what I did was I worked on the setup, and I've got it down to in the mid to upper 50-second range. And as a matter of fact, as soon as I get done with this discussion, there's going to be a replay of a lap I ran that is a 50.78, I believe is exactly what it is. So you'll see that next, and that'll give you an idea of exactly the line I ran, and so you can hear the on and off throttle, that kind of thing, for the racetrack. Now, that should be more than enough to get you the 105 rating on this track. For me, at 105%, the AI qualify on the pole at about a 51.1 second lap. You ought to be able to easily get that with this particular setup. So let's go ahead and get started. The shocks, pretty boring. As you can see, they're exactly the same as they are with my other setups, 10 all the way across the board. Let's move on to weight. Left weight we can pretty much ignore because it's maxed out because we're on an oval. Front weight, in this particular case, I wanted to keep it pretty close to 50% because you're on the throttle so much at this track, and I want the car to rotate quite easily, but I found that going too much below 50.2 and the car was seeming to over-rotate with me. So I left it at about 50.2, and that seemed to be a pretty good balance to get where I wanted to go. Wedge is at 51%. Again, I wanted to get that, have a little bit of a snug feeling in the wheel, give me some better force feedback, and I seem to get that when I run a little bit of positive wedge. Ride heights as normal are both at their minimums. Let's go to the springs. And I can tell you that if for no other track, I am 100% convinced that running the stiffest possible front springs is a great idea here at Pocono. Reason being, in particular, the left front spring. The more front spring you put in this thing, the better the car turns. So I maxed out the left front spring, and that enabled me to really drive the car hard, and the car responded with increases in grip each time. I did back off a little bit on the right front spring, again, just to help the car turn a little bit easier on entry. Feel free to play around with that number. If you're getting the entry that is a little bit too free for you, the car wants to spin out on entry, then feel free to bump this up closer to, if not equal to, 1200 to match the left front. Let's look at the rear springs. The rear springs, you've got some choices here. At first, when I was working on this setup, the car, every time I loosened it up, it would just simply turn better and get faster. So I started to reduce this left rear spring, and I kept going and I kept going and I kept going. Until finally I was at the minimum of 200 pounds on the left rear and the maximum of 600 pounds on the right rear. Now, traditionally in this game, I've not had good luck with using a large spring split in the rear of the car, but I kept going with it. Now, as you can see, I've since raised it back up, and here's the reason. In combination with the track bar, which we'll talk about in a second, I feel like using a smaller rear spring split, in this case it's 200 pounds, which is measured as 600 pounds minus 400, that gives you a spring split of 200. The smaller that number is, the more stable the car seems to be going through the corner, into and off the corner, and then I can use other means such as the track bar to get the car to turn overall. So that's what I decided to do here. The car just felt a lot better using the 400 and 600 pound rear springs as opposed to using a much larger split. Tire settings, I really didn't mess around with too much. Again, I reached a point where I was already outrunning easily the AI at 105%, so I simply didn't worry about going much further. But I have a sneaky suspicion that continuing to increase the tire pressures here, you can get faster and faster. So definitely feel free to give that a shot, and let me know in the comment section below if you have any success with that. Miscellaneous settings, as with previous setups, the cambers are maxed out at +10 for the left front, -10 for the right front. Sway bar is at 1.5, although you could probably get by with lowering that some. The biggest reason to keep this at a higher number is, which 1.5 is as high as I've used in any of my setups, but the reason to keep it at a higher number, or even to increase it from here, would be to try to control the weight shift into and off the corners. If you want there to be less weight shift, then use a higher number, and that can help stabilize the car some. But at a certain point, as you continue increasing this, the car will simply get tighter and it won't turn very well. So it's interesting to try to find a balance there. Moving on to the rear sway bar, as normal, I'm not using it. Left and right track bar. Now for these, as you can see, very high numbers. I had been using numbers that were multiple inches lower on the left and right when I was using the larger spring split in the rear of the car, but because I decided to use a much smaller split in the rear, I have increased this. This is basically what helps the car to turn going through the corner and allows you to drive it so aggressively and spend so much time on the throttle. This is it. As you can see, I've got these numbers reversed. Traditionally, you would have the left side be lower than the right side, or at the very minimum, they would be equal. In this case, what I've done is I've made the left side higher because it helps me to be very aggressive on entry and drive the car in really deep. And then the lower number on the right side relative to the left side means that I can get back on the gas and the car doesn't step out as much on me or get loose on corner exit. Brake bias, usually I just gloss right over this, but in this particular case for this track, it is very important and something that you're probably going to want to play around with based on your particular setup, if you're using a controller versus different wheel pedal combinations and so forth. In this case, I've used 70%. The reason is it's important at Pocono because I have seen that if I use just a little bit of brake on corner entry, I can drive it in pretty deep, use a little bit of brake, and then that helps to stabilize the car because the car is pretty free on its own in order to keep the on throttle time high. But I've used 70% because that helps to sort of tighten the car up under braking. Basically, the higher the number you use on brake bias, the more the car will want to go straight whenever you're braking. So as I'm on corner entry, as I'm on the brake, it helps to stabilize the car. The car wants to get loose. Applying a little bit of brake helps to tighten that up and neutralize the car. So again, you could run this setup without using the brake. It's just that the car would be extremely free and probably lose some time because of that. Moving on to grill tape, as usual, I don't use any. Wheel lock and steering offset are not particularly important. So we move on to gear settings. Now, in this case, I don't really mess around a whole lot with first and second gear. I did mess around with a little bit with the third and fourth gear as far as the differences between these two. As you can see, I go from a third gear at 125 to a fourth gear at 1.0. The smaller the difference between these two is what you would want to use if you plan on shifting at this track. Now, for me, I decided against it simply because I determined that if I use a rear end ratio of 3.33, that it essentially maxes out the RPM. I mean, I'm turning over 9,000, especially at the entry of turn one. I'm turning 203, 204 miles an hour, something along those lines entering turn one, and it basically maxes out the RPM. Now, normally I wouldn't do that, but here at Pocono, it seems to work well because by doing it there, it enables the RPM as they drop through the corner to still be up high enough that I'm within the engine's power band, and the engine pulls very nicely coming up off the corner, which is normally you'd want to shift going into the corner to keep your RPMs up and then come off the corner and shift again down the next straightaway once your RPMs reached a certain level. Well, by using this particular gear, I can avoid that by maxing out the RPMs at the end of the straightaway and still keeping them pretty high mid-corner. Now, one thing you could do if you decided you wanted to shift, you could bring this number down to 110, 115, maybe even 120, depending on how you wanted to do this. I tested 110 and I believe 115, and it worked okay. But if you're going to do that, you're going to want to bring this number down to around, I believe a 3.0 is what I tested. And again, it'll work, but you're going to have to be very vigilant about shifting gears each corner, as particularly turns 1 and 3, because you're going to lose some RPMs there, and you're going to want to keep the engine wound out. So the higher the RPM, the better, seemingly at this corner, and I decided to use a 3.3 gear, and it works great. All right, now stay tuned, and you'll get to see the lap. Again, this lap is a 50.78, which seems to be at 2 to 3/10 faster than anything I've seen the AI run. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat Evolution.